My name is Rose, and I am 68 years old. As a retired construction project manager, I spent 4 decades meticulously overseeing the building of homes, ensuring structural integrity and safety for countless families. My own home, built brick by my father's hands in 1955, was more than just a house. It was a cherished landmark, a symbol of our family's legacy and endurance. I had personally maintained it for over 30 years, seeing it as a tangible piece of our history, a testament to hard work and love. I had provided stability and education for my 3 children, Mark, Lisa, and David, supporting them through every challenge of adulthood, always believing in their shared appreciation for heritage and family values. Then my world collapsed in the most unthinkable way. Without warning, I received a bewildering legal notice stating that my home was to be sold. My investigation revealed the horrifying truth: my own children, Mark, Lisa, and David, had forged my signature on a power of attorney document and signed a $600,000 sale contract behind my back. "You're clearly senile, Mom," Mark yelled when I confronted him, his face twisted with cold determination. "We're drowning in $450,000 of debt, and you have no humanity left for your own children." Brenda, Mark's wife, sneered with calculated cruelty. "Honestly, Rose, clinging to this old brick box when your brain is clearly broken, you're just a liability now. Even my teenage grandson, Ethan, coached by his parents, publicly mocked me. Grandma's house is ancient. Sell it and get with the times. You're totally crazy. My home, my independence, my very sanity. All of it stolen by the people I had sacrificed everything to raise and protect. I felt utterly discarded, dehumanized, profoundly disrespected by my own flesh and blood. Yet as despair threatened to consume me entirely, something deep within my construction manager's soul ignited a cold, righteous fury. That unwavering drive for integrity that had guided me through decades of complex building projects began to focus on the most important construction job of my life: rebuilding the truth. What Mark, Lisa, David, Brenda, and their corrupt real estate agent, Mr. Jenkins, didn't know was my secret weapon. I had kept meticulous project logs from my father's original construction of our home documentation that would prove ownership beyond any doubt. Most importantly, my recently installed security cameras had captured Mark and Brenda practicing my signature in my own living room, discussing their forgery plans, their greed, and their strategy to gaslight me into compliance. My retired real estate lawyer ally was already reviewing the evidence, preparing for the fight of our lives. This time, their insidious fraud wouldn't just unravel. It would expose their shocking lack of humanity, reclaim my sanctuary, and secure my future. Sometimes, the most precious things are worth fighting for, and sometimes the truth is the strongest foundation of all. The morning after receiving the sale notice, I sat in my living room, the same room where I had rocked my children to sleep, where we had celebrated countless birthdays and holidays, where my father had taught me the value of craftsmanship and integrity. Now it felt like a courtroom where I was the accused, facing my own children as prosecutors. Mark arrived with Brenda, their expressions showing not the confusion or concern I had hoped for, but the cold determination of people executing a plan. Lisa followed reluctantly, her discomfort obvious, but her silence deafening. David had declined to come at all, sending only a text saying he supported whatever Mark decided. Mark's sweetheart. I began holding the legal documents with trembling hands. There's been some terrible mistake. This says I agreed to sell our home, but I never signed anything. I would never sign anything like this without discussing it with all of you first. Mark's response was swift and brutal, delivered with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "Mom, you're clearly senile," he said, his voice carrying no trace of the warmth I remembered from his childhood. "You signed those papers 3 weeks ago. You just don't remember because your mind is going. This $600,000 sale is going to save us from our $450,000 in debt. You're losing your mind if you think you can stop this now." I stared at my firstborn son, searching his face for any hint of the boy I had raised, the young man I had supported through college, through his first job, through every crisis of his adult life. Mark. "I've never had any cognitive problems. My doctor just cleared me at my last physical. I remember everything about our family, about this house, about the sacrifices I made to keep us together. How can you say I'm senile?" Brenda stepped forward with a smugness that made my skin crawl. "Honestly, Rose, clinging to this old brick box when your brain is clearly broken, it's pathetic. You're living in the past and you're a liability to your own family. Mark's construction business is failing because of the debt, and you're sitting on $600,000 worth of equity like some kind of hoarder." The casual cruelty of her words, the way she spoke about my home, as if it were just an asset to be liquidated, sent a chill through my heart. "This isn't just a house," I said, my voice breaking despite my efforts to stay strong. "This is family history. Dad built every brick of this foundation with his own hands. Your grandfather's sweat and love are in these walls. Don't you remember the stories I told you about watching him work, about how proud he was to create something lasting for his family?" Lisa finally spoke, but her words were perhaps more devastating than Mark's anger. "Mom, please don't fight this," she whispered, unable to meet my eyes. "It'll just make things worse for everyone. We really do need the money. Maybe this is for the best." The betrayal in her passive acceptance cut deeper than Mark's aggression. This was my daughter, my sensitive child, who had always been my ally, now choosing convenience over conscience. But the cruelest blow came from my teenage grandson, Ethan, Mark's son, who had clearly been coached for this performance. "Grandma's house is ancient," he announced loudly, as if delivering a line in a school play. "Sell it and get with the times. Nobody wants to live in some old dump from the 1950s. You're crazy if you think anyone cares about this place." Hearing these words from the boy I had helped raise, the child who had spent countless weekends in this house, learning to build birdhouses in the same workshop where his great-grandfather had crafted furniture, felt like a physical assault. Mr. Jenkins, the real estate agent they had brought to facilitate the transition, stood in the corner with the practiced sympathy of someone who had orchestrated many such family destructions. "Mrs. Patterson," he said with oily concern, "I've worked with many clients who struggle with accepting reality as they age. Sometimes the kindest thing family can do is help make difficult decisions. The market is very favorable right now, and waiting could cost everyone significant money." I looked around the room at these people who were casually discussing the theft of my home as if it were a reasonable business transaction. The walls that had sheltered 3 generations of my family were being appraised like merchandise, and my own children were the auctioneers. "I never signed any papers," I said again, louder this time. "I would remember signing something that important. This has to be some kind of fraud or mistake." Mark's mask of patience finally slipped, revealing the rage beneath. "Mom, you're embarrassing yourself and embarrassing us," he snapped. "The papers are legal. The sale is happening, and if you keep fighting it, we'll have to take more drastic measures to protect you from yourself." The threat was clear, though not explicitly stated. Cooperate or face guardianship proceedings that would strip away what little control I had left. Over the following days, Mark and Brenda escalated their campaign of psychological warfare. They began bringing potential buyers through the house during what they claimed were routine inspections, parading strangers through my private spaces while discussing renovation plans as if I weren't there. "We'll definitely want to gut the kitchen," one developer said, standing in the room where I had cooked thousands of family meals. "These old fixtures are worthless. The whole place needs to be brought into the 21st century. The lot is the real value," another added. "The house itself is probably a teardown. Nobody wants to live in something this outdated." Each word was like a nail in the coffin of my family's history, but Mark and Brenda watched these discussions with obvious satisfaction. They also began spreading rumors in the neighborhood about my supposed mental decline. I learned this when my longtime neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, approached me with awkward concern. "Rose, dear," she said hesitantly, "I've been hearing some troubling things from your son. He says you've been having some difficulties with your memory and decision-making. Is there anything I can do to help?" The humiliation of realizing that my own children were destroying my reputation in the community where I had lived for decades was almost unbearable. Every sympathetic look from neighbors, every carefully worded inquiry about my health reminded me that Mark and Brenda's lies were spreading like poison through the social fabric of my life. But the most devastating realization came when I overheard a phone conversation between Mark and someone I assumed was his business partner. "Yeah, the old lady is fighting it, but she doesn't have any real options," he said with casual dismissal. "Once we get her declared incompetent, we can liquidate everything and clear our debts. The house alone will cover most of what we owe, and then we can move forward without her dragging us down." Standing in my own hallway, listening to my son discuss my destruction like a business strategy, I understood that this wasn't just about money. This was about erasing me, reducing me to an obstacle to be removed rather than a mother to be honored. That night, alone in the house that had been my sanctuary for 3 decades, I made a decision that would change everything. I would not go quietly into the darkness they had planned for me. The woman who had spent 40 years ensuring that buildings stood strong against every storm was about to discover that she possessed the same structural integrity she had always demanded from her projects. The assault on my dignity intensified with military precision. Mark and Brenda had clearly been planning this campaign for months, and now they executed each phase with calculating cruelty. The formal papers demanding that I move into the small accessory dwelling unit behind my main house arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail to ensure there would be legal documentation of my notification. The language was clinical and condescending, referring to my advanced age and diminished capacity to maintain such a large property. Due to safety concerns and practical considerations, the letter read, "The family has determined that Mrs. Rose Patterson would be better served by relocating to the smaller, more manageable living space, while the main residence is prepared for sale." Prepared for sale, as if my home were a stage set being dismantled after the final performance. Brenda's social media campaign was perhaps even more insidious than the legal maneuvering. She had begun posting carefully crafted updates that painted their actions as progressive family planning and financial responsibility. "Sometimes love means making hard choices," she wrote beneath a photo of herself and Mark at what appeared to be a real estate seminar. Streamlining family assets and modernizing wealth management isn't always easy, but it's necessary for everyone's future security. The comments were worse than the posts themselves, friends and acquaintances praising Mark and Brenda's wisdom in handling a difficult situation, expressing sympathy for their burden in caring for an aging parent who couldn't accept practical realities. "You're so patient with Rose," wrote someone I recognized from church. "It must be hard when older people can't adapt to change." But the conversation that shattered my last illusions about my family's motivations was one I overheard by accident. I had gone to the garden to tend my roses when I heard Brenda's voice through the open kitchen window, talking on her phone with the casual cruelty that only comes from believing you're unobserved. "The old lady is clinging to sentimental junk like it's worth something," she said with dismissive laughter. "We'll liquidate it all once we get her moved out. Mark's $450,000 debt depends on this sale, and I'm not going to let some senile woman's attachment to the past destroy our future." The person on the other end of the call must have asked about my well-being, because Brenda's response revealed the depth of her callousness. "Oh, please, she'll be fine in assisted living. It's not like she's contributing anything to society anymore. Once the house sells, we'll finally be free to live our lives without her constant drama and demands for attention." Standing in my garden among the roses I had planted and tended for 20 years, I felt the last of my maternal illusions crumble. This wasn't desperation or confusion or even misguided concern for my welfare. This was calculated dehumanization, reducing me to an inconvenient obstacle between them and financial freedom. That evening alone in my house, I found myself remembering a time when such financial freedom had seemed impossible for my family. A time when I had made sacrifices that my children would never know about, could never know about, because the truth would have destroyed the very foundation of who they believed themselves to be. After Arthur's death 35 years ago, we had faced financial ruin that went far beyond normal medical bills. My husband's long illness had indeed been expensive, but what threatened to destroy us completely was something I had discovered only after his funeral. Arthur had been involved in a fraudulent real estate scheme that had cost investors over $1 million. As a construction project manager, I understood how the scheme had worked. Arthur, desperate to provide for his family during his illness, had used his architect credentials to validate property assessments that he knew were falsified. When investors lost their money, they began looking for someone to hold responsible. The scandal would have destroyed not just Arthur's memory, but our children's future. Mark was applying to college. Lisa was in high school, with dreams of becoming a teacher. David was still just a child. The shame and legal consequences would have followed them for the rest of their lives. So I made a choice that cost me everything I had inherited from my own parents. The ancestral land that had been in our family for 4 generations, including the small cemetery where my grandparents were buried, had to be sold piece by piece to cover Arthur's debts and the restitution demands. I worked 16-hour days for 3 years, taking no salary from my construction management business, funneling every penny toward clearing our family's name. I told my children that the land sales were investment decisions and that our reduced circumstances were temporary adjustments. They never knew that their college educations were paid for with the graves of their great-grandparents. They never knew that the comfortable middle-class life they remembered was built on my willingness to sacrifice our entire heritage to protect their future. Now, 35 years later, Mark was demanding that I sacrifice the last tangible piece of our family's legacy to cover his own financial mistakes. When I tried to address this pattern during our next family meeting, Mark's response was swift and brutal. "Mom, you're always playing the martyr with your talk about sacrifices." He snapped his voice, filled with the contempt that comes from someone who has never had to sacrifice anything meaningful. Your past choices are your own business. Brenda thinks you're trying to manipulate us with guilt and sentimentality instead of accepting reality. Lisa, who had always been more sensitive to emotional undertones, looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Her silence was perhaps more painful than Mark's aggression because it meant she was choosing complicity over courage. But the cruelest moment came when Ethan, my 17-year-old grandson, delivered what was clearly a coached response to my emotional appeals. "Grandma, you're crazy if you think anyone cares about old family stories," he said, with the casual dismissal that only teenagers can muster. "Why don't you just die already and let us get on with our lives?" The words hit me like physical blows. This was my grandson, the boy I had taught to use tools in the same workshop where my father had learned carpentry, the child who had once begged for stories about our family's history. Mr. Jenkins, ever helpful in facilitating my destruction, presented what he called a generous settlement offer the following week. "Mrs. Patterson," he explained with practiced sympathy, "your family is prepared to offer you $50,000 in exchange for your voluntary agreement to the sale. This would allow you to move into a very nice assisted living facility where you'd be properly cared for, and it would relieve your children of the burden of making these difficult decisions for you." The offer was presented as generosity, but I understood it for what it was: a bribe to cooperate in my own dispossession. $50,000 for a house worth $600,000 in exchange for giving up my independence and accepting institutionalization. "If you refuse this offer," Mr. Jenkins continued, "your son is prepared to pursue guardianship proceedings based on your demonstrated inability to make rational financial decisions. That process would be much more expensive and much more public." The threat was clear: accept their theft gracefully or face the humiliation of a public competency hearing where my own children would testify that I was mentally unfit to manage my own affairs. That night, I sat in my father's workshop, surrounded by the tools he had used to build our home, and I understood that I was facing more than just financial fraud. I was confronting the complete erasure of everything I had worked for, everything I had sacrificed, everything I had believed about the bonds between parents and children. But I was also a woman who had spent 40 years solving complex problems, managing difficult people, and ensuring that structures could withstand the worst storms. The skills that had made me successful in construction management were about to be tested in the most personal arena possible. My children had underestimated me. They saw an aging woman clinging to sentiment, but I was actually a professional project manager preparing for the most important construction job of my life, rebuilding the truth from the ground up. The foundation was already in place. The evidence was already gathered, and I was finally ready to begin construction on the most important project I had ever undertaken my own justice. The final assault came without warning, executed with the precision of a military operation designed to break whatever resistance I had left. I was in my garden on a Tuesday morning, tending the tomatoes that my father had taught me to grow in this same soil 70 years earlier when the convoy arrived. Mark and Brenda led the procession, followed by a van from Memory Lane Gardens, assisted living facility, 2 orderlies in matching uniforms, and Dr. Miller, a man I had never met, but who carried an official-looking clipboard and the authority to change my life forever. "Mrs. Patterson, Doctor," Miller announced with practiced sympathy, "your family has arranged for your transition to a more appropriate living situation. Memory Lane Gardens is a beautiful facility, and you'll be much safer there." I looked at this stranger who spoke as if he knew what was best for me, who had spent perhaps 30 minutes reviewing fabricated reports about my supposed mental decline, and who was now prepared to uproot me from the home where I had lived for 3 decades. "I'm not going anywhere," I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "This is my home. I built my life here, and I'm not leaving." The orderlies stepped forward with movements that were practiced and efficient. They had done this before I realized. They had dragged other bewildered elderly people from their homes, convinced they were providing necessary care while they facilitated theft and abandonment. "Ma'am, we can do this the easy way or the hard way," one of them said, his voice gentle but firm. "But you are coming with us today. Your family is concerned about your safety." I watched in horror as they began boxing up my most precious possessions. My father's original architectural blueprints for the house, carefully preserved for 70 years, were carelessly shoved into cardboard boxes marked storage. My construction project logs, documenting decades of professional achievement, were treated like worthless paperwork. The photo albums that chronicled 3 generations of my family's life were wrapped in newspaper like items at a garage sale. "Please," I begged, looking desperately at Lisa and David, who had arrived to witness my removal. "Don't let them do this. This is my home, our home. You grew up here. You know every room, every story, every memory these walls hold." Lisa's face crumpled with what appeared to be genuine anguish, and for a moment I thought she might find the courage to speak up for me. "Mom," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, "maybe this really is for the best. Maybe you'll be happier with people to take care of you." But even as she spoke, she took a step backward, aligning herself with Mark and Brenda rather than defending her mother. Her tears were real, but they weren't enough to overcome her cowardice. David, my youngest son, the one I had hoped might retain some loyalty to family bonds, looked at me with empty eyes and said nothing. His silence was perhaps more devastating than Mark's aggression or Lisa's weakness, because it represented a complete emotional disconnection from the woman who had raised him. As the orderlies took my arms and began leading me toward the van, Mark delivered his final cruelty with the efficiency of someone who wanted to end an unpleasant task. "Consider this closed, Mom," he said, not even looking at me as he typed on his phone. "You lose. Don't contact us again. Ever. This is for your own good. You're losing your mind, and we're not going to let you drag us down with you." Brenda, standing beside the home I was being forced to abandon, smirked with satisfaction that she didn't bother to hide. "Honestly, Rose, this house is far too much for you now," she said with condescending kindness. "Think of it as a fresh start, paid for by your own assets. You should be grateful we're taking such good care of you." But the final blow came from Ethan, my 17-year-old grandson, who delivered his line with the cruel precision of someone who had been coached to inflict maximum damage. "Grandma, you're crazy," he said loudly, making sure the neighbors could hear. "Why don't you just die already and stop causing problems for everyone?" The words echoed in my mind as they loaded me into the van like cargo, driving me away from the only home I had ever truly loved. Memory Lane Gardens was everything I had feared. Sterile, impersonal, designed to warehouse the inconvenient elderly while their families moved on with their lives. My room was small, clinical, furnished with generic furniture that held no memories and offered no comfort. That first night lying in a narrow bed, in a place that smelled of industrial disinfectant and quiet despair, I broke down completely. The weight of my isolation, the magnitude of my betrayal, the loss of everything I had worked for, it all crashed down on me at once. And in that darkness, I found myself confessing a secret I had carried for 35 years, a burden so heavy that it had shaped every decision I had made as a mother and as a woman. The truth about Arthur's death was far more complex and devastating than the simple story of illness and medical bills that I had told my children. My husband hadn't just been a victim of a fraudulent real estate scheme, he had been one of its architects. As a brilliant architect struggling to provide for his family during the recession of the 1980s, Arthur had become involved with developers who were inflating property values and selling worthless land to unsuspecting investors. His professional credentials lent credibility to assessments he knew were fraudulent, and his desperation made him willing to participate in what became a $1 million fraud. When the scheme collapsed and investors began demanding restitution, Arthur confessed everything to me just weeks before his death. The stress and guilt had literally been killing him, manifesting as the mysterious illness that the doctors couldn't properly diagnose or treat. "Rose," he had whispered from his hospital bed, "I've destroyed everything. Our name, our children's future, our family's honor. The lawsuits will take everything we have and more. Mark and Lisa and David will grow up knowing their father was a criminal. So I made a choice that cost me not just money, but my entire identity. I used my construction management connections to quietly negotiate settlements with the defrauded investors. I liquidated every piece of property my family had owned for 4 generations, including the small family cemetery where my great-grandparents were buried. Most painfully, I helped Arthur create a cover story for his illness and death that protected our children from ever learning the truth about their father's crimes. The official records showed a man who died fighting cancer, not a man who died from the stress of orchestrating fraud. I had spent 35 years protecting that lie, working extra hours to pay debts my children never knew existed, sacrificing my own heritage to preserve their memories of their father. Now Mark was calling me incompetent and stealing my home, never knowing that his comfortable childhood had been purchased with the graves of his ancestors. He was destroying the woman who had saved his reputation before he was old enough to understand what reputation meant. The cosmic irony was overwhelming. I had sacrificed everything once to protect my children from shame and financial ruin, and now they were inflicting both on me without a moment's hesitation. Lying in that institutional bed, I understood that my greatest act of maternal love had become the foundation for my children's capacity to betray me. By teaching them that love meant absorbing consequences and covering up uncomfortable truths, I had enabled them to become people who could rationalize any cruelty as necessary for their own well-being. But I also understood something else. The meticulous documentation I had done throughout my career, the careful record-keeping that had made me successful as a construction manager, hadn't stopped when I retired. I had been preserving evidence of my competence, my ownership, and my family's true history for decades. The woman who had once protected her family by hiding the truth was about to become the mother who would fight for justice by revealing it. And this time, the foundation I built would be strong enough to support not just my own freedom, but the restoration of everything that had been stolen from me. The evidence was there, waiting in secure locations my children didn't know about. The truth was ready to be constructed brick by brick, fact by fact, until everyone could see the structure of lies that had been built on my suffering. My children had forgotten that I was a master builder, but they were about to be reminded that the strongest structures are built to last, and that a woman who had survived 35 years of carrying other people's secrets was more than capable of constructing her own justice. Memory Lane Gardens was not the peaceful sanctuary its name suggested. It was a warehouse for discarded lives, a place where inconvenient elderly people were stored, while their families moved on with their comfortable lives. The walls were painted in cheerful pastels that fooled no one, and the artificial flower arrangements couldn't mask the smell of industrial disinfectant and quiet desperation. From my first day, I sensed something was fundamentally wrong beyond the obvious theft of my freedom. The staff treated me with a particular kind of condescension that felt rehearsed, practiced, as if they had been briefed about my supposed condition. "Now, Mrs. Patterson," said Janet, the head nurse, with a smile that never reached her eyes, "you're a resident here now, dear, not a construction manager. Let's focus on your current needs, shall we?" When I mentioned my background in project management, or tried to discuss the structural integrity of buildings they exchanged, knowing glances and made careful notes in my file. These delusions about her professional competence are quite common. I overheard Dr. Miller telling a staff member, "Her family has been very generous in their donations to our facility, and they've provided extensive documentation about her declining cognitive state." I learned later that Mark and Brenda had been making substantial monthly payments to Memory Lane Gardens, along with detailed reports about my supposed mental deterioration. The staff believed they were protecting me from my own paranoid fantasies about property law and construction principles. Every conversation I tried to have about blueprints or building codes was met with patronizing nods and careful documentation. Mrs. Patterson became agitated today when discussing her imaginary construction projects. They would write in my file, creating a paper trail of my supposed decline. When I asked for paper to sketch some basic architectural concepts, they brought me adult coloring books featuring simple flowers and butterflies. "These will be much more relaxing for you, dear," the activity coordinator said with practiced kindness. The visits from my grandchildren were perhaps the cruelest torture of all. Mark and Brenda brought Ethan and Chloe for carefully orchestrated 30-minute sessions, always with staff present, always following the same script designed to reinforce my helplessness. "Grandma, do you remember who I am?" Ethan would ask, his 15-year-old voice flat and emotionless. He had been coached to speak slowly, clearly, as if I were a confused child rather than his grandmother. Chloe, now 13, would bring craft supplies and simple puzzles. "The nurses said you like easy activities now, Grandma," she would say with forced brightness. "We can make friendship bracelets together." The most devastating visit came 6 weeks after my arrival. Ethan walked in carrying a large photograph, his face showing the calculating cruelty that reminded me terrifyingly of his father. "Look, Grandma," he said, holding up the image with obvious satisfaction. "Dad and I took this yesterday." It was a picture of them standing in front of my beloved home, both smiling triumphantly beside a bright red "Sold" sign planted in the front yard. My father's house, the sanctuary I had maintained and cherished for 30 years, was gone. "Dad says you don't need it anymore since you live here now," Ethan continued with teenage callousness. "He says old people should be in places like this where they're safe from themselves." I stared at the photograph at my precious garden, now trampled by strangers at the windows, where I had watched seasons change for 3 decades. The home where 3 generations of my family had built their lives was nothing more than a real estate transaction. "Dad said I could show you the picture, but not give it to you," Ethan added with a smirk. "He doesn't want you to get confused about ownership again." The public humiliation continued beyond the facility walls. Brenda had turned my destruction into a social media celebration, documenting every step of the process with the enthusiasm of someone planning a wedding. Exciting news, she posted beside photos of my empty house. We've successfully sold this beautiful property for $600,000. Mark's vision for streamlining family assets is becoming reality. Sometimes the hardest decisions lead to the greatest opportunities. The comments were devastating. Friends and neighbors congratulating them on their wisdom in handling a difficult situation, expressing admiration for their patience with an unreasonable elderly woman. But worse were the architectural renderings she posted, showing planned renovations to my home. They intended to gut everything my father had built, with his hands strip away every personal touch I had added over the decades and transform it into a sterile, modern showcase. "Can't wait to see Mark's contemporary vision replace this outdated design," she wrote beneath images that showed my father's careful craftsmanship being demolished. Out with the old, in with the new. Each post was like watching the murder of everything I had loved broadcast to the world as entertainment and progress. My financial destruction was complete and systematic. Mark had assumed full control of my accounts as my court-appointed guardian, redirecting my pension payments to cover my care expenses. When I tried to call my former construction company or my bank, I was told that all communications had to go through my guardian. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson," the bank representative said with practiced sympathy. "Your son has informed us that you're no longer competent to manage your financial affairs. All requests must be submitted through proper legal channels." The facility staff had been instructed to monitor my phone calls and mail, ostensibly for my protection. I overheard two nurses discussing my situation one afternoon as they passed my room. "The Patterson woman is high maintenance," one said with obvious annoyance. "Her family barely visits, except for those short check-ins. Must be exhausting dealing with someone so demanding and paranoid." The casual dismissal in their voices broke something inside me. I had become a problem to be managed, a burden whose protests were just symptoms of her disease. But one evening, as I sat in my narrow bed, feeling completely forgotten by the world, something unexpected happened. Maria, a young aide who worked the night shift, approached with unusual nervousness. "Mrs. Patterson," she whispered, glancing around to make sure we weren't being watched. "I found this in the donation box. Someone left it specifically for you." She pressed a small worn copy of Architectural Principles and Practice into my hands. It was an old edition, its pages yellowed with age, but inside the front cover, written in faint pencil, were two words that made my heart race: Eleanor's help. Eleanor Martinez, my former colleague and closest friend in the construction industry. She had retired 3 years ago, but we had maintained our professional friendship. If she knew what was happening to me, if she was trying to reach out. Maria leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "There's a phone number written on page 200, she whispered. "Someone wants you to call them, but be careful. The staff monitors everything." As she slipped away into the darkness, I clutched the book to my chest. Maybe I wasn't completely alone after all. Maybe someone somewhere remembered the competent professional I had been, rather than the confused victim I was portrayed as. Eleanor knew my work, knew my mind, knew that the woman they were describing as incompetent was actually one of the sharpest project managers of her generation. If she was reaching out, it meant she understood that something was terribly wrong with the narrative being told about me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a spark of hope penetrate the darkness that had consumed my life. The construction manager in me began to analyze the situation like a complex building project. What materials did I have? What foundation could I build on? What allies might still be available? The evidence was still out there somewhere. The security camera footage of Mark and Brenda practicing my signature, the documentation of my mental competence, the proof that this entire guardianship was built on lies and forgery. I had spent 40 years solving structural problems that others thought impossible. Now I was facing the most important construction project of my life, rebuilding the truth from the rubble of my family's betrayal. The woman who had been dismissed as a confused old lady was actually a master builder preparing for the most crucial project she had ever undertaken. And this time, the foundation would be strong enough to support not just my freedom, but the complete exposure of everyone who had participated in my destruction. 8 months after my imprisonment at Memory Lane Gardens, I discovered that Mark and Brenda had transformed my professional destruction into their opportunity for public acclaim. While I was struggling to remember my own name, according to their fabricated reports, they were building careers as experts in modern architecture and property development. The Modern Architecture and Sustainable Development Conference was announced with great fanfare across construction industry publications and social media networks. Mark Patterson, as he now styled himself professionally, was listed as the keynote speaker, described as a visionary developer who transforms stagnant properties into thriving community assets. I learned about the conference from Janet, the head nurse, who mentioned it with obvious pride during one of my wellness check conversations. "Mrs. Patterson, your son is going to be famous," she said with the enthusiasm of someone sharing good news. "He's speaking at a big architecture conference about modernizing old buildings. Isn't that wonderful? You must be so proud." The flyer she showed me was a masterpiece of subtle character assassination. Mark's biographical description mentioned his innovative approach to revitalizing outdated properties and his expertise in overcoming resistance to necessary renovations. The conference promised to teach developers how to maximize property value while respecting family dynamics and navigate emotional attachments to inefficient structures. My life's work was being used as a case study in what not to do. The day of the conference, a board staff member turned on the live stream in the common room, thinking it might be educational for us residents to see successful family members. What I witnessed was a systematic dismantling of everything I had believed about craftsmanship integrity and the value of preserving architectural heritage. Mark took the stage wearing an expensive suit I had never seen before, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who had found his calling. He spoke about the importance of breaking free from outdated construction methods and the necessity of overcoming sentimental attachments to inefficient design. My family's property presented a classic case of emotional hoarding disguised as heritage preservation, he said with carefully practiced authority. A 1950s structure that had been maintained by someone with an obsessive attention to detail but no understanding of modern efficiency standards. The audience of developers, architects, and property investors hung on every word. Here was someone who looked like them, who had credentials they respected, telling them about the courage required to modernize family assets, despite resistance from previous generations. The original owner was a construction project manager. Mark continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing professional insights. But her methods were rigid, inefficient, focused more on preserving the past than creating value for the future. My meticulous craftsmanship, the careful maintenance I had performed for 3 decades, the pride I had taken in preserving my father's work, all of it was being portrayed as obsessive behavior that prevented progress and prosperity. Brenda's presentation was even more devastating. because it was delivered with the authority of someone claiming to understand the psychological dynamics of family property disputes. Dealing with elderly family members who resist necessary changes requires patience and strategic thinking, she explained to the captivated audience. They often become emotionally dependent on structures that no longer serve any practical purpose. She spoke about the courage required to make difficult decisions for family members who couldn't adapt to changing market conditions, and the liberation that comes from choosing economic reality over emotional manipulation. Sometimes, the people who seem most attached to a property are actually the ones preventing it from reaching its full potential, Brenda concluded with practiced sympathy. Love sometimes means making hard choices that seem cruel, but are actually necessary for everyone's well-being. But the most heartbreaking part of the conference was the video presentation featuring my grandchildren. Ethan, now 15, had clearly been coached to speak about his education in modern construction techniques. I used to think old buildings were important because my grandma said they had character, he said with the earnest expression of a teenager trying to sound mature. But my dad taught me that efficiency and profit margins are more important than sentimental value. The audience murmured their approval, seeing a young man who had been educated about practical priorities rather than emotional attachments. Chloe's contribution was a demonstration that made my heart break completely. My 13-year-old granddaughter stood beside a display showing one of my old hand-drawn blueprints next to a computer-generated design. Grandma used to draw these really slowly, by hand, she explained with giggles that felt like knife wounds. It took her forever, but we can make better designs in minutes with digital software. Her way was so old-fashioned and slow. My careful, precise draftsmanship, the skill I had developed over 40 years of professional practice, was being mocked as obsolete by my own granddaughter. The love and attention I had put into every line, every measurement, every detail, reduced to a joke about inefficiency. Watching this presentation from a wheelchair in the common room of Memory Lane Gardens, I felt my last reserves of emotional strength crumble. The children I had taught to appreciate craftsmanship were describing their relationship with my work as if it had been a burden rather than a gift. A panel discussion followed the presentations featuring several experts in property development and family psychology. They analyzed Mark's case as a textbook example of successful intervention and praised his courage in prioritizing economic reality over emotional manipulation. This case illustrates how difficult it can be to help elderly family members accept necessary changes, said Dr. Rebecca Coleman, a family psychologist. Construction professionals in particular can become overly attached to their work, seeing criticism of their methods as personal attacks rather than practical assessments. The woman was literally describing my profession as a risk factor for mental illness, suggesting that people should be suspicious of elderly contractors who showed too much pride in their past projects. As the conference concluded with a standing ovation for Mark and Brenda's wisdom in handling their challenging family situation, I closed my eyes and tried to process the magnitude of what I had witnessed. Everything I had been, everything I had worked for, everything I had believed about the value of careful craftsmanship and preserving family heritage. It had all been perverted into evidence of mental illness and economic irresponsibility. But as I prepared to return to my room, feeling more defeated than I had thought possible, something unexpected happened. A staff member approached with a message that someone had called asking about my well-being. A Mr. Frank Morrison called she said with obvious reluctance. He said he was a retired architect who worked with you years ago. He seemed very concerned about your situation and asked if you were receiving proper care. Frank Morrison. I remembered him well, a respected architect who had collaborated with me on several major projects in the 1980s and 1990s. If he had seen the conference, if he was reaching out. He left his number, the staff member continued, but said he understood if you weren't able to receive calls. He mentioned something about knowing the difference between competence and decline and wanting to help if possible. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope. Frank had worked with me for years. He knew my capabilities, understood my methods, recognized the difference between careful craftsmanship and obsessive behavior. If he was willing to vouch for my competence, if he was prepared to challenge the narrative that Mark and Brenda had constructed about my mental state, the woman who had been destroyed by lies was about to discover that truth had its own allies, professionals who understood that experience and wisdom don't disappear just because someone claims they do. My story wasn't ending with humiliation and professional destruction. It was approaching the moment when people who truly understood construction integrity would stand up for both the buildings and the builders who created them. 1 year after the theft of my home began, Mark delivered what he clearly intended to be the final blow to my existence. The lawsuit papers were delivered to Memory Lane Gardens by a process server who seemed embarrassed to be serving legal documents to a woman living in an assisted care facility. The lawsuit was massive, comprehensive, and designed to destroy any possibility of my ever recovering from this nightmare. Mark was suing me for $1 million in damages, claiming that my persistent harassment and delusional accusations had caused severe emotional distress to his family and irreparable damage to his reputation as a property developer. Mrs. Patterson, my overwhelmed public defender, explained during our brief consultation, they're alleging that your continued attempts to contact family members and your public statements about the property sale constitute a form of stalking and defamation. Every letter I had written trying to explain my side of the story, every phone call I had made attempting to reach my grandchildren, every desperate attempt to maintain some connection to my family, all of it was being used as evidence of my supposed mental instability and criminal behavior. But the lawsuit was just the beginning of Mark's final assault. Using his growing reputation as a successful property developer and Brenda's connections in the business community, he contacted the State Construction Workers Retirement System with concerns about my mental competence and fitness to receive benefits. We've received reports that you may be suffering from cognitive decline and engaging in erratic behavior, the administrator explained during a phone call that felt like a death sentence. Your family has expressed serious concerns about your ability to manage finances responsibly. The investigation that followed was swift and devastating. Based on the testimony of Mark and Brenda, supported by Dr. Miller's fabricated medical reports, the retirement system determined that I had engaged in conduct unbecoming a professional contractor and posed a potential risk to public safety. My construction pension, the modest income that had been my only source of financial security, was permanently revoked. 40 years of service, a spotless professional record, dozens of successful projects that had provided safe housing for countless families. All of it counted for nothing when weighed against the testimony of my own children. The board feels that maintaining your benefits would send the wrong message about our commitment to construction safety, the administrator explained with bureaucratic coldness. Effective immediately, all payments will cease, and any professional honors will be withdrawn. Within weeks, I was completely destitute. The legal fees from defending against the criminal charges had already consumed what little savings Mark hadn't seized. The loss of my pension meant I could no longer afford even the basic care at Memory Lane Gardens. The eviction from the assisted living facility was scheduled for maximum public humiliation. Brenda had somehow learned about the proceedings and alerted local media, framing it as a story about the consequences of elder mental illness and the importance of family intervention. Elderly woman evicted after harassing family, read the headline in the local newspaper. The accompanying photo showed me carrying my few remaining possessions in garbage bags, looking exactly like the broken, dangerous woman they had portrayed me to be. Standing on the sidewalk with everything I owned stuffed into plastic bags, I felt the full weight of what they had accomplished. They hadn't just taken my home or my reputation. They had taken my very identity as a productive member of society. The return to a homeless shelter was even more humiliating than I could have imagined. Harbor Light Emergency Services had a bed available, but the intake process required me to explain how a former construction project manager had ended up sleeping on a cot in a room with 5 strangers. First-time homeless, asked Dorothy, a woman about my age, who occupied the cot next to mine. It gets easier, but it never stops feeling like a nightmare. But Mark and Brenda's indifference to my suffering was perhaps the cruelest aspect of my destruction. As I struggled with homelessness and destitution, they continued to build their public profiles as successful property developers and family leaders. Mark's social media posts during this period showed a family thriving in their newfound prosperity. Photos of expensive vacations, private clubs, professional conferences where he spoke about property development, all funded by the $600,000 he had stolen from me. Grateful for the opportunities that come from making hard decisions, he posted beneath a photo of himself at a luxury resort. Sometimes you have to prioritize the future over the past to create real value. When a local reporter asked him about my homelessness during an interview about his business success, Mark's response was chilling in its casual dismissal of my humanity. I have no legal or moral obligation to support someone who has repeatedly demonstrated poor judgment and hostile behavior, he said with the confidence of someone who had successfully rebranded theft as responsibility. Personal accountability means accepting the consequences of your actions. The reporter's follow-up question about whether he felt any compassion for my circumstances received an answer that cut me to the bone. Compassion without boundaries enables destructive behavior, Mark replied with practiced authority. The best thing we can do for people who refuse to accept help is let them experience the natural consequences of their choices. But Brenda's celebration of my destruction was the most vicious display of all. Using money that she claimed came from Mark's consulting fees and property development profits, she purchased a custom-built smart home and organized a public dedication ceremony. This home represents our family's commitment to innovation and our confidence in the future, she announced at the event, which was covered by local business news as a success story about entrepreneurship and vision. The house featured every modern convenience and efficiency system available, a stark contrast to the outdated craftsmanship of my father's home. Ethan and Chloe were photographed cutting a ceremonial ribbon, smiling and laughing as if they were celebrating a great victory. This house will be our base for all the exciting projects Dad has planned, Chloe told the reporter with the enthusiasm of a teenager who had been taught that my destruction was something to celebrate. The stress of watching my complete annihilation while struggling with homelessness and poverty finally broke my body as thoroughly as it had broken my spirit. The heart attack struck while I was standing in line at a food pantry, the chest pain so severe that I collapsed on the concrete. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" the paramedic asked as I drifted in and out of consciousness in the ambulance. "You're having a major cardiac event. We're taking you to the emergency room." In the intensive care unit, hovering between life and death, my mind began to retrieve memories I had buried for decades. The fragments came back like pieces of a puzzle, gradually forming a complete picture that was both terrifying and illuminating. I remembered a construction project from the early 1970s, one of the first buildings my father had worked on after establishing his reputation. The Riverside Elementary School had been his pride and joy, but I had discovered years later that he had cut corners on the foundation to save time and money. The structural flaw had never caused a catastrophic failure, but it had required expensive repairs that the school district had quietly absorbed. My father had confessed the truth to me on his deathbed, and I had spent years making anonymous donations to the district to cover the ongoing maintenance costs. In my semi-conscious state, I began to understand that the pattern of protecting family secrets, of covering up inconvenient truths to preserve reputations, had been passed down through generations. I had learned from my father's example that love sometimes meant accepting responsibility for other people's mistakes. The realization that I was trapped in a cycle of enabling that stretched back decades gave me something I hadn't felt in over a year: clarity about how to break the pattern and fight back. As the machines monitored my failing heart, I made a promise to myself and to the memory of the professional I had once been. If I survived this, I would not continue the family tradition of protecting people from the consequences of their choices. The evidence was still there somewhere. The truth was still waiting to be constructed, and I was finally ready to build something strong enough to withstand any storm they could send against it. I survived the heart attack, though the doctors said it was touch and go for 4 days. When I finally opened my eyes in the cardiac intensive care unit, the first face I saw was Maria, the young aide from Memory Lane Gardens, who had helped me connect with Eleanor. "Mrs. Patterson," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Eleanor has been calling the hospital every day. She says she's been working with some lawyers building a case. You're not alone in this." As I slowly recovered the memories that had surfaced during my near-death experience, crystallized into a clear understanding of what I needed to do. This wasn't just about proving my competence or reclaiming my property. It was about breaking a cycle of enabling that had poisoned my family for generations. From my hospital bed, with Maria's help, I recorded what I intended to be my final attempt to reach Mark's conscience. My voice was weak, my appearance haggard from months of stress and poverty, but my mind was clearer than it had been in over a year. "Mark," I said, looking directly into the camera Maria held, "I need you to see what you've become. I have recordings of our conversations where you and Brenda discussed forging my signature and stealing my home. I have evidence that the competency evaluation was fabricated and that Dr. Miller was paid to support your lies." I paused, gathering strength for the most difficult part of my message. "But more than that, I need you to understand the pattern you're continuing. Just like I protected your father from the consequences of his choices, just like I covered up your grandfather's construction flaws to preserve his reputation, you've learned that family members exist to absorb blame and sacrifice themselves for your benefit." My voice broke as I spoke about the cycle I now recognized. "I taught you that truth was negotiable when it served family interests. I showed you that love meant protecting people from uncomfortable realities. But what you're doing to me isn't love, Mark. It's the logical conclusion of everything wrong with how our family has handled difficult truths. The video was raw, emotional, devastating in its honesty. I laid out the timeline of their conspiracy-played audio recordings of Mark and Brenda discussing the forged documents and detailed the systematic campaign of character assassination that had destroyed my life. This has to stop, I concluded. Not just for me, but for Ethan and Chloe. They're learning that lying and manipulation are acceptable tools when you want something. You're teaching them to become the kind of people who destroy the people who love them most. Maria assured me she would personally deliver the video to Mark, hoping that seeing my deteriorated condition and hearing the truth spoken so plainly might awaken some vestige of conscience. But Brenda had been monitoring my situation through contacts at the hospital, and she intercepted the message before Mark ever saw it. What happened next was so calculated, so vicious, that it redefined my understanding of human cruelty. Brenda took my desperate plea to my son and turned it into a weapon against me. Using professional video editing software that Mark's property development business had purchased, she manipulated my recording with stunning sophistication. She spliced sentences together, altered the tone of my voice, added ominous background music, and removed all context that might generate sympathy. The heavily doctored video titled Elderly Woman's Delusional Hospital Rant was sold to Entertainment Tonight for what I later learned was a substantial sum. Brenda marketed it as exclusive footage of a mentally ill woman's breakdown, complete with expert commentary from paid psychologists who had never met me. The national news segment aired on a Thursday evening, reaching millions of viewers. The anchor introduced it with practiced concern. Tonight, a disturbing look at how dementia can transform a grandmother into a source of fear for her own family. This exclusive footage shows the deteriorating state of 68-year-old Rose Patterson, whose paranoid accusations have torn apart a loving family. They played my manipulated words over images of Mark and Brenda looking devastated, their faces masks of fake concern and manufactured grief. My desperate plea for my son to remember the truth was twisted into evidence of my complete disconnection from reality. The psychological experts analyzed my facial expressions, my tone of voice, my choice of words, concluding that I was clearly suffering from severe paranoid delusions with possible advanced dementia. They praised my family's patience and strength in dealing with such a challenging and potentially dangerous situation. What we're seeing here is a textbook case of elder mental illness manifesting as persecution fantasies, explained Dr. Stephen Walsh, a psychiatrist who had never examined me. The patient has created an elaborate narrative where she's the victim, when in fact she's the source of trauma for everyone around her. But the cruelest part was Mark's response. He appeared on the show via satellite link, his performance a masterpiece of manufactured anguish. "This is incredibly painful for our entire family," he said, his voice breaking with practiced emotion. "To see my mother, who was once such a capable woman, reduced to these conspiracy theories and accusations. It's heartbreaking. We've tried everything to help her, but she refuses treatment and continues to blame everyone else for her problems." The interviewer asked about my claims regarding the forged documents and the evidence I claimed to possess. Mark's response was flawless in its manipulation. "My mother has always had difficulty accepting responsibility for her actions," he said with carefully crafted sadness. In her confused state, she's reinterpreted normal family decisions as some kind of conspiracy against her. We've had to make difficult choices to protect both her and our children from her increasingly erratic behavior. He brought Ethan on camera, my 16-year-old grandson, who looked genuinely distressed by the situation. The boy had been thoroughly coached, but his emotions appeared authentic. "I just want Grandma to get better," Ethan said, his young voice heavy with manufactured concern. "She used to be so nice, but now she just says scary things about Dad and Mom. I wish she could be normal again so we could see her." The performance was devastating. Mark came across as a devoted son, struggling with his mother's tragic decline, while I appeared to be exactly what they claimed, a delusional old woman whose paranoid fantasies were traumatizing innocent children. Lisa appeared briefly in the segment, offering subtle support for Mark's narrative. "My brother has shown incredible strength in dealing with this situation," she said with feigned admiration. "It's not easy when someone you love becomes a source of fear rather than comfort." The segment ended with an expert panel discussing the warning signs of elder mental illness and the importance of protecting children from unstable family members. My destruction was being used as an educational opportunity to help other families recognize and respond to similar situations. But what Mark and Brenda didn't know was that Eleanor had been watching the broadcast with growing horror and outrage. As my former colleague and lifelong friend, she recognized immediately that something was fundamentally wrong with their narrative. The day after the broadcast aired, Eleanor contacted Frank Morrison, the architect who had reached out to me at Memory Lane Gardens. Together, they began building a coalition of construction professionals who remembered my work and understood that the woman being portrayed as incompetent was actually one of the most skilled project managers of her generation. Eleanor had also hired a retired real estate attorney named James Richardson, who specialized in elder fraud cases. James had reviewed the doctored video with forensic experts and quickly identified signs of digital manipulation. The timestamps have been altered, sentences have been spliced together, and Mrs. Patterson's voice has been subtly modified to sound more confused and agitated. He explained to the private investigator Eleanor had hired with funds from a growing coalition of my supporters. But perhaps most importantly, James had discovered irregularities in the original property sale that suggested the power of attorney documents were indeed forged. His preliminary investigation had uncovered evidence that Mark and Brenda might have committed multiple felonies in their theft of my home. As I lay in my hospital bed, unaware of the national humiliation being broadcast about me, these unlikely allies were building a case that would eventually expose the sophisticated fraud that had destroyed my life. The truth was finally mobilizing, and it was more powerful than any lie Mark and his conspirators had constructed. Sometimes justice takes longer than we hope, but when it arrives, it has the foundation to support the weight of even the most elaborate deception. My story wasn't ending with defeat and humiliation. It was approaching the moment when all the evidence I had carefully preserved, all the allies who had never stopped believing in me, and all the truth that had been buried under months of lies would finally be constructed into something strong enough to withstand any storm. The woman who had been dismissed as a confused old lady was actually a master builder preparing for the most crucial project she had ever undertaken. And this time, the foundation would be strong enough to support not just my freedom, but the complete exposure of everyone who had participated in my destruction. 18 months after my heart attack, I sat in the office of James Richardson, the elder law attorney Eleanor had found for me. The funding for my legal battle had come from an unexpected source, a small property I had purchased decades earlier as an investment, something I had completely forgotten during the chaos of my destruction, but which Eleanor had helped me locate in old tax records. "Rose," James said, "with the gravity that comes from 40 years of fighting for elderly clients, we're going to file the most comprehensive elder abuse case this state has ever seen. The evidence you preserved, combined with what our forensic experts have uncovered, is absolutely devastating." The federal civil and criminal lawsuit we launched sent shockwaves through the legal community and the media. We charged Mark and Brenda with criminal elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and defamation. Mr. Jenkins, their corrupt real estate agent, faced additional charges for notarizing fraudulent documents and conspiracy. Patterson versus Patterson became the most watched courtroom drama of the year, with cameras broadcasting live to millions of viewers around the world. The same media that had once participated in my destruction was now captivated by my fight for justice. The courtroom was packed on the day we presented our evidence. Mark and Brenda sat at the defendant's table, their confidence from months earlier replaced by visible anxiety. Their expensive lawyers shuffled through papers with the desperate energy of people who knew they were fighting a losing battle. "Your Honor," announced my lead attorney, Sarah Chen, "we would like to present Exhibit A surveillance footage from Mrs. Patterson's home security system taken in the weeks leading up to the fraudulent property sale." The large screen in the courtroom flickered to life, and suddenly the truth I had been trying to tell for over 2 years was visible for the world to see. The hidden camera in my home office had captured everything with crystal clarity. The first footage showed Brenda sitting at my desk practicing my signature over and over again on blank sheets of paper. Her concentration was intense, methodical, as she worked to perfect the forgery that would steal my home. "Notice the date and time stamp," Sarah explained to the jury. "This footage was taken 3 weeks before Mrs. Patterson allegedly signed the power of attorney documents." But the most damning footage came next. The camera had captured a meeting between Mark, Brenda, and Mr. Jenkins in my living room, discussing their conspiracy in detail. "Are you sure the old lady won't figure this out?" Mr. Jenkins could be heard asking, his voice filled with the nervousness of someone participating in a crime. "She's too senile to understand what's happening," Brenda replied with chilling confidence. "We've already got the doctor on board to certify her incompetence if she makes trouble. $450,000 in debt doesn't pay itself." Mark's voice was even more devastating. "The beauty of this plan is that she can't prove she didn't sign the documents. Even if she remembers her signature being forged, who's going to believe a crazy old woman over her loving family?" The gasps from the courtroom gallery were audible. Here was my son discussing my destruction like a business transaction, admitting that the power of attorney was forged and that they planned to use my supposed mental illness to cover their crimes. The recording continued, capturing their discussion of how to manipulate my grandchildren. "Ethan and Chloe are the key," Brenda could be heard saying. "If they publicly support our version of events, it adds credibility to the incompetence narrative. Coach them to act worried about Grandma's behavior, make them think they're protecting her." But perhaps the most chilling moment came when Mark expressed impatience with the timeline of their fraud. "How long is this going to take?" he asked with obvious frustration. The longer she's around asking questions, the more complicated this gets. Brenda's response was delivered with casual cruelty that made the entire courtroom recoil. "Don't worry about it. At her age, stressed as she is, nature will probably take care of the problem for us. We just need to make sure she gets overwhelmed enough to just stop being a problem." The implication was unmistakable. They weren't just stealing my property. They were hoping the stress would kill me. When Mr. Jenkins was called to testify, the corrupt real estate agent's composure crumbled immediately under questioning. "Mr. Jenkins," Sarah asked, "did you witness Mrs. Patterson sign the power of attorney documents that authorized the sale of her home?" Jenkins squirmed in his seat, glancing desperately at Mark and Brenda's legal team. That is, the documents were properly notarized." "That's not what I asked you, Mr. Jenkins. Did you personally witness Mrs. Patterson sign these documents?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Jenkins broke down completely. "No," he sobbed, his professional reputation crumbling in real time. "Mrs. Patterson never signed anything. Brenda forged the signature and paid me $5,000 to notarize it without Mrs. Patterson being present. They said it was a family emergency and that she was too sick to come to the office." His confession sent shockwaves through the courtroom and immediately led to his arrest for notary fraud and conspiracy. When Mark was called to testify, I watched my eldest son approach the witness stand with a mixture of sorrow and anticipation. For months he had been the confident architect of my destruction. Now faced with irrefutable evidence of his crimes, he looked like what he had always been underneath the manipulation, a desperate man who had chosen greed over love. "Mr. Patterson," Sarah began, "do you recognize the voices in this surveillance footage discussing the forgery of your mother's signature?" Mark stared at the screen as they replayed his own words admitting to the conspiracy. The color drained from his face as he realized that every lie he had told, every false accusation he had made was now exposed for the world to see. That's taken out of context," he began, but his voice lacked any conviction. "Mr. Patterson, you stated on this recording that your mother was too senile to understand what's happening and that you had got the doctor on board to certify her incompetence. Are you now claiming this statement was taken out of context?" The weight of his exposure seemed to crush Mark physically. He began to hyperventilate, his carefully constructed composure crumbling completely. The man who had appeared on national television as a concerned son was revealed as a sophisticated fraud, and the recognition of his public humiliation overwhelmed him completely. I never meant," he stammered, then broke down into incoherent sobbing that echoed through the silent courtroom. Judge Harrison called for a recess as Mark collapsed at the witness stand, but the damage was complete. The jury had seen the truth, the media had recorded his breakdown, and the world now understood what had really happened to me. Lisa, who had been present throughout the trial, sat in the gallery with tears streaming down her face. When our eyes met across the courtroom, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: genuine remorse, devastating guilt, and a silent plea for forgiveness that spoke louder than any words could have. Brenda attempted to maintain her composure longer than Mark, but when confronted with the recordings of her own voice, discussing my hoped-for death, even her practiced manipulation failed her. She was led away in handcuffs, screaming about how ungrateful I was for all their help. As I sat in that courtroom, watching the truth finally triumph over the lies that had destroyed my life, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. There was vindication, certainly, relief that the nightmare was finally ending, but there was also profound sadness for what we had all lost in this terrible journey. The woman who had once protected her family by hiding uncomfortable truths had become the mother who had fought for justice by revealing them. The evidence had spoken, the truth had prevailed, and for the first time in over 2 years, I could see a future that belonged to me rather than to the lies that had been told about me. Justice was being served, but it came with a price that none of us could have anticipated. Still sitting in that courtroom, surrounded by the wreckage of my family's betrayal, I knew that every moment of the struggle had been worth it. Truth, I had learned, was indeed the strongest foundation of all. Judge Harrison's verdict was swift and comprehensive, delivered with the authority of someone who had been deeply moved by the evidence presented. The courtroom was silent as he spoke his words, carrying the weight of absolute justice. The court finds Mark Patterson and Brenda Patterson guilty of criminal elder abuse, fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud, he announced with controlled anger. The systematic campaign of lies and financial exploitation perpetrated against Rose Patterson represents one of the most callous and sophisticated cases of family theft this court has ever encountered. Mark was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years. Brenda received 8 years with eligibility for parole after 6. The judge also ordered full restitution of the $600,000 home sale, plus punitive damages totaling $1.8 million. This court finds that Rose Patterson is and has always been mentally competent, professionally skilled, and personally loving, Judge Harrison declared. The evidence clearly shows that she was the victim of a calculated fraud designed to steal her property, destroy her reputation, and ultimately cause her death through stress and despair. Those words meant more to me than any monetary award. For over 2 years, I had been told I was senile, incompetent, dangerous. To hear a federal judge state unequivocally that I was the victim, not the perpetrator, was a restoration of my very identity. The judge continued with a statement that would be quoted in elder law textbooks for years to come. Elder abuse is not just about financial exploitation or physical neglect. It includes the systematic destruction of an elderly person's dignity, autonomy, and sense of self. When families weaponize the legal system against their elders, they attack the very foundation of what makes us human. Mr. Jenkins was immediately stripped of his notary license and faced additional criminal charges for his role in the conspiracy. His real estate business was permanently closed, his reputation destroyed by his participation in my family's fraud. 3 weeks after the sentencing, I received my first letter from Mark in prison. It was pages long, written in the shaky handwriting of someone whose world had completely collapsed. Mom, it began, I know you probably never want to hear from me again, but I need you to know that I understand now what I did to you. The therapy here is helping me see how desperate I became, how the debt and pressure twisted my thinking until I could justify destroying the person who loved me most. The letter went on to detail his participation in various rehabilitation programs, his work with a prison psychologist, and his slowly growing understanding of the magnitude of his betrayal. I don't expect forgiveness, he wrote. I just want you to know that the man who hurt you wasn't really me. It was what I became when greed and desperation took over. I'm trying to find my way back to the person you raised, but I know it may be too late. Reading his letter, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at what he had done, sadness for what he had become, and a tiny flicker of hope that perhaps someday some version of reconciliation might be possible. Brenda's fate was different and final. She remained unrepentant, her few communications from prison filled with bitterness and blame. She had been abandoned by everyone, including her own family, and seemed incapable of accepting responsibility for her actions. But the most important part of my healing came through my relationship with Lisa and David. 6 months after the trial, Lisa came to see me at the home I had finally reclaimed. My daughter looked older, worn down by guilt and the weight of her complicity. When she saw me standing in the doorway of our father's house, She broke down in tears that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "Mom," she sobbed, "I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry for everything. I was scared and weak, and I abandoned you when you needed me most." We talked for hours that day, Lisa finally finding the courage to acknowledge her role in my suffering. She hadn't actively participated in the fraud, but her silence and passive acceptance had enabled Mark and Brenda's cruelty. "I knew something was wrong," she admitted. "I knew you weren't senile or incompetent, but it was easier to believe Mark than to stand up to him. I was a coward, Mom. I chose convenience over courage." The process of rebuilding our relationship was slow and careful, but gradually the bonds we had shared began to resurface. Lisa became a regular visitor, helping me restore the house-sharing meals and working to understand how our family had fallen so far from its values. David's journey back to our family was quieter but equally meaningful. My youngest son had been the most passive during the crisis, but he was also the most genuinely remorseful. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my business," he said during one of our conversations. "I told myself that Mark knew what was best, that you would be okay. But I knew better, Mom. I knew you, and I knew what they were doing was wrong." David began visiting regularly, offering practical help with the house and quiet companionship. He didn't talk as much as Lisa, but his actions spoke louder than words. He was there when I needed him, present and supportive in ways he hadn't been during the crisis. My relationship with Ethan and Chloe required the most delicate rebuilding. Both teenagers had been traumatized by their parents' arrest and the public revelation of their crimes. They had spent 2 years believing their grandmother was mentally ill and dangerous, only to discover that they had been manipulated into participating in her destruction. Ethan, now 17, was the first to reach out. He came to see me 6 months after the trial, his young face marked by guilt and confusion. "Grandma," he said, his voice breaking, "I said such terrible things to you. I told you to die. How could I have been so cruel?" Looking at this young man, barely an adult, struggling with the weight of his family's destruction, I felt only compassion. He had been manipulated, just as I had been turned into a weapon against me by adults he trusted. "You were lied to," I told him, simply holding him as he cried. "You believed what the adults in your life told you to believe. That's not your fault, sweetheart. That's never your fault." Chloe's reconciliation with me was even more emotional. My 15-year-old granddaughter had created a new drawing, this one showing our entire family holding hands under a rainbow with special attention paid to including her grandmother in the center. "I want to learn about real construction," she told me during one of her visits. "Not the digital stuff Dad taught me about, but the way you and great-grandpa did it, with your hands and your heart." The process of healing our family required professional help. We all participated in family therapy sessions designed to help children recover from parental alienation and to rebuild trust after systematic manipulation. But gradually, the bonds we had shared began to resurface stronger now because they were built on truth rather than lies. Ethan and Chloe began spending weekends with me, learning about their family's history, understanding the value of the craftsmanship and integrity that had built our home. A year after the trial, I stood in my father's workshop, watching Ethan learn to use the same tools that had built our house 70 years earlier. Chloe was at the kitchen table, carefully copying one of my hand-drawn blueprints, asking questions about every measurement and detail. "Why did you keep fighting, Grandma?" Chloe asked during one of our sessions. It would have been easier to just give up. I thought about her question for a long moment, watching the late afternoon sunlight stream through the windows of the home I had almost lost forever. "Because some things are worth fighting for," I told her finally. Truth is worth fighting for. Family is worth fighting for when it's built on honesty rather than lies. And this house represents everything good about the people who came before us. My vindication was complete. My home had been restored, my reputation rebuilt, my assets recovered. But the real victory was quieter and more personal. It was the gradual healing of relationships that mattered more to me than any legal judgment. The woman who had been dragged from her home as a supposed incompetent had become a nationally recognized advocate for elder rights. But more importantly, she had become a grandmother again, beloved and trusted by children who now understood the difference between truth and manipulation. Justice had been served, but it had come at an enormous cost. Still sitting in my restored home with my daughter and grandchildren planning our future together, I knew that every moment of the struggle had been worth it. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not for victory, but for the right to love and be loved honestly. And in the end, that honest love was the strongest foundation I could have built. 3 years after the trial that changed everything, I stood in my father's meticulously restored workshop, watching Ethan put the finishing touches on a wooden jewelry box he was crafting for his girlfriend. The scene was so beautifully ordinary, so perfectly peaceful, that it took my breath away. My home had been returned to me exactly as my father had built it, but somehow it felt transformed. Every room had been lovingly restored, not just to its original condition, but to something even better, a living testament to the power of truth family and the enduring value of things built to last. The kitchen where I had been forcibly removed now filled regularly with the aroma of Sunday dinners shared with Lisa and her family. The living room where Mark had coldly announced his theft was now a place of laughter and honest conversation. The workshop where my father had taught me to appreciate craftsmanship was again teaching those same lessons to a new generation. I had used part of the restitution money to establish the Heritage Home Preservation Project, a nonprofit organization that helped elderly homeowners protect their properties from family fraud and taught young people the value of architectural history. The work had given me a sense of purpose I had never expected to find at my age. "Mrs. Patterson," said Jennifer Walsh, one of the volunteers who helped with our educational programs, "we have 3 more families requesting help this month. Word is spreading about what you've accomplished. The project had grown beyond anything I had imagined. We provided legal assistance to elderly property owners, offered workshops on recognizing and preventing elder fraud, and most importantly, created programs that brought young people together with older craftspeople to learn traditional building techniques. My relationship with Lisa had evolved into something deeper and more authentic than what we had shared before this nightmare began. She visited twice a week, helping with the nonprofit work and spending quiet time just talking about everything we had learned about family loyalty and the courage required to tell the truth. "I think about the woman you were before all this happened," she told me one afternoon as we worked in the garden together, "and I realize you're even stronger now. Not because of what you survived, but because of how you chose to rebuild afterward." Lisa had become my closest collaborator in the Heritage Project, using her skills as a teacher to develop curricula that helped children understand why preserving family history matters. She often brought her own students to visit, showing them that the elderly weren't just repositories of outdated information, but active participants in creating a better future. David's reconciliation with me had been quieter but equally meaningful. He visited every Sunday, usually arriving early to help with household maintenance, staying late to share dinner, and conversation. He had left his corporate job to become a carpenter, saying he wanted to work with his hands the way his grandfather had. I spent so many years thinking success meant accumulating wealth, he reflected during one of our talks. But watching what happened to Mark showed me that real success is about building something that lasts, something that makes the world a little bit better. David was now one of the lead instructors in our traditional construction workshops, teaching teenagers the satisfaction that comes from creating something beautiful and permanent with careful attention to detail. Ethan and Chloe had blossomed into thoughtful, principled young adults who understood that their family's true wealth lay not in money or property, but in integrity and authentic relationships. Both had chosen career paths influenced by our family's experience. Ethan, now 20, was studying social work with a focus on elder advocacy. I want to help other families avoid what we went through, he explained when he announced his major. I want to make sure elderly people have voices that can't be silenced or dismissed. Chloe, 18, and preparing for college, had decided to study architecture with an emphasis on historic preservation. I want to save old buildings the way you saved our family, she told me with the passion that only young idealists possess. Both grandchildren spent significant time at the house, not because they were obligated to, but because they genuinely enjoyed learning from me and contributing to the Heritage Project. They had become advocates themselves, speaking at schools and community groups about the importance of respecting elderly family members and preserving architectural heritage. My correspondence with Mark had continued throughout his incarceration, his letters showing gradual but genuine progress toward understanding and accountability. He was scheduled for release in 2 years, and while our relationship would never return to what it had been, it had evolved into something based on honesty rather than the enabling patterns of the past. I know I can never undo what I did to you, he wrote in his most recent letter, but I hope that when I'm released, you might allow me to spend the rest of my life trying to make amends. Not for forgiveness because I don't deserve that, but because it's the right thing to do. I had decided to visit him next month, bringing photos of the restored house and updates about Ethan and Chloe's accomplishments. It wouldn't be reconciliation exactly, but it would be an acknowledgement that even the most damaged relationships could evolve towards something healthier when built on truth. Brenda remained bitter and unrepentant, her occasional letters filled with blame and self-pity. I had stopped reading them months ago, choosing instead to focus my energy on relationships that could actually heal and grow. My memoir, Built to Last: A Grandmother's Fight for Truth and Heritage, had become a bestseller, not because it was sensational, but because it was honest. Thousands of elderly people wrote to thank me for giving them hope, for showing them that they could fight back against family manipulation, for proving that their dignity and their heritage mattered. The speaking engagements that had become a regular part of my life took me across the country, sharing my story with audiences of social workers, lawyers, family court judges, and community groups. Standing in front of these audiences, I felt a purpose that went far beyond my personal vindication. The most important thing to remember, I would tell these groups, is that elderly people are not burdens to be managed or problems to be solved. We are human beings with rights, dignity, and often a lifetime of wisdom to share. When we fight for elder rights, we're fighting for the kind of society we want to be. But perhaps the most meaningful part of my new life was the quiet moments. Sitting on my front porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sunrise over the same neighborhood where my father had chosen to build our home. Having dinner with Lisa and her family, sharing stories and making new memories, reading letters from people whose lives had been touched by the Heritage Project. I had learned that strength isn't just about fighting back against cruelty, though that was important. Real strength is about rebuilding after the fight is over, about choosing hope over bitterness, about transforming pain into purpose. The woman who had been dismissed as a confused old lady had become a nationally recognized advocate, a best-selling author, and a symbol of hope for elderly people everywhere. But more importantly, she had become someone who understood that survival isn't just about enduring. It's about thriving in spite of everything that tries to break you. My victory was complete, not because I had defeated my enemies, but because I had reclaimed myself. The truth had set me free, but even more than that, I had set myself free by refusing to let lies define my future, standing in my father's house, surrounded by 3 generations of family members who now understood the difference between love and manipulation. I felt a peace that went deeper than vindication. Then, this was what heritage truly meant. Not just preserving old buildings, but passing down the values that make those buildings worth preserving. The future stretched ahead of me, full of possibility and purpose. Ethan would graduate soon and begin his career helping other elderly people find their voices. Chloe would learn to design buildings that honored the past while serving the future. Lisa would continue teaching children to value their elders and their history. For the first time in years, I looked forward to that future with genuine joy. Life, I had learned, was not about avoiding betrayal or hardship. It was about what you chose to build after the worst had already happened. And I had chosen to build something beautiful from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. As I write these final words, 5 years have passed since that terrible day when I discovered my children had forged my signature and stolen my home, transforming me from a respected construction project manager into a suspected incompetent. Today, I sit in my father's meticulously restored workshop, surrounded by the tools he used to build our family's foundation, but everything has changed. My days now overflow with purpose and genuine fulfillment. Lisa stops by twice a week to help with the Heritage Home Preservation Project, where we've helped over 200 elderly families protect their properties from exploitation. Ethan calls every Sunday from his job at the Elder Rights Legal Clinic, sharing stories about the cases he's working on. Chloe sends photos from her architecture program, where she's learning to design buildings that honor historical integrity while meeting modern needs. The foundation I established has become a model for communities across the country, proving that elderly people aren't just recipients of care, but active contributors to society's well-being. My book continues to give hope to families facing similar struggles, and the speaking engagements allow me to travel the country, sharing a message that resonates in courtrooms, community centers, and family workshops. Elderly people are not disposable, and our heritage is not negotiable. Mark writes every month from prison, his letters showing genuine progress toward understanding and accountability. Our relationship may never fully heal, but it has transformed into something honest, which is perhaps more valuable than what we lost. David has become a master craftsman, teaching young people that real wealth comes from building things that last. Even my correspondence with Mark has evolved into something based on truth, rather than the enabling patterns that once defined our family. The greatest lesson from my journey is this: our worth as human beings isn't determined by our age, our vulnerability, or our dependence on others for support. It's determined by our courage to stand up for truth, our refusal to accept abuse as inevitable, and our commitment to fighting for dignity, not just our own, but for every person who has been told their voice doesn't matter anymore. To anyone listening to my story who sees their own struggle reflected in it, please know this: you are not powerless. You are not confused. You are not a burden. Your heritage matters, your dignity matters, and your fight for justice matters. Truth has a way of surfacing even when it seems buried beneath mountains of lies and manipulation, because integrity creates foundations that can support any weight. The woman I am today, peaceful, purposeful, surrounded by genuine love and engaged in meaningful work, was forged in the fires of the worst betrayal imaginable. But fire doesn't just destroy, it also purifies. It burns away everything false and leaves behind only what is real, what is strong, what is built to last. I am Rose Patterson. I am a survivor, an advocate, a grandmother, a builder. I am living proof that it's never too late to reclaim your life, never too late to fight for truth, and never too late to transform your deepest pain into your greatest purpose. And that perhaps is the strongest foundation of all.